Thank you, everyone, for coming in, and thank you, Wayne, for being here. We are glad to have you. And for those who don't know, Wayne will do his own introduction. But if you haven't heard, if you want to know about scaling, this is the guy to talk to. Wayne's taken multiple platforms to over 1 billion messages a day, and a lot more than 1 billion messages a day in some cases, like on Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So a lot of knowledge here to share. Wayne is a big fan of horizontal over vertical scaling, and we get requests for both here. So it's kind of nice to have some perspective on what the options are, what the trade-offs are. We can get servers to tens of millions of messages an hour per server, but with great speed comes great potential impact if the server goes down. So Wayne, why don't you start off? Let us know your journey, how you got into the MTA world, and what you've been doing in it.
Cool. Yeah. So,
and he's
and I'm a nice guy. So my journey to MTAs was somewhat accidental, like a lot of folks. I used to make a joke, and you have a meeting with a room full of 100 Unix admins, and you say, who would like to volunteer to run SendMail? No one will raise their hand except the new FNG guy who doesn't know better. So, so I'm actually a musician. I have a bachelor's degree in music. I actually worked on music rows, an engineer, sound engineer. And like a lot of folks in entertainment, I couldn't make any money. That's kind of the way that rolls. And I started fixing computers on the side. I had some good luck to have friends who knew about the World Wide Web, got into web programming. And then finally got my first real IT gig was at a dial-up mom and pop ISP. And if those of you with gray hair remember, that was a big deal, was to get your own mailbox for email. That wasn't CompuServe, right? And so I was the FNG, and they needed a SendMail admin, and that's where I started. So my first gig out of phone support was running SendMail, and turned out to be a very long-lived relationship with email at that point. The next big hop was to SBC. I was just doing plain old AIX telephone mid-range support. And then they were trying to do the SBC Prodigy Alliance, if anyone remembers that terrible project that failed. So the idea was SBC was consolidating their acquisitions of Baby Bells. They wanted to get rid of the Baby Bell mail platforms because those are regulated. And so by pushing it off to a non-regulated entity like Prodigy, they could remove a lot of burdens. That failed. What it eventually became was SBC Yahoo. So I was the guy turning off the servers, and stuff was going to Yahoo. Fast forward a couple more years, there's a small company in Indianapolis that was sending email for commercial purposes called ExactTarget. And I thought to myself, well, I could do that. So the Prodigy, SBC Prodigy platform, I managed outbound, which turned out to be a very good thing because that's what ESPs do, is outbound. And as a whole, that platform had got to about 1 billion a month, SBC Yahoo Gateway, we'll call it. So I interviewed with ExactTarget, and they, it's funny, the story was the guy that was the hiring manager literally ran down the hallway and said, hire this guy now. Because here I fall out of the clouds in Indianapolis of all places, and I've actually sent 1 billion emails a month. So when I got to ExactTarget, that's what we had, 1 billion emails a month. I remember the poster, and everybody was very proud. I mean, that's a lot of email for 2008, right? To give you kind of the state of the environment when I got there, they were using PowerMTA 3 after many different other MTAs that failed. PowerMTA was all Marketing Cloud. ExactTarget, which they became Salesforce Marketing Cloud, is all that they've ever used as PowerMTA. So they were using Pentium 3 physical servers with the public IP bound on the actual Ethernet card. We remember those days, right? So, you know, we ran into a lot of issues there because you have injections pinned to a host that are on queue. And so something bad happens, like they triple their send overnight. Clients never do that, right? And now I've got, you know, I'm fighting like iOS I'm fighting compute, I'm running out of memory. I mean, it's basically an outage. And the bad thing was then the jobs are piling up in the composer tier. So it's not like the jobs are going away. And essentially you've got this tiny funnel that is the blocker for everything going out. So we also couldn't move IPs. I mean, that's, to tell a customer, well, okay, the queue age out 72 hours, so we're going to have to wait 3 days, essentially suspend your sending for 3 days, let all your mail age out, then unbind the IP, move it to another host. Not very portable, right? So there's no way to add any capacity because this is just a physical Pentium 3 server. So the Composer app, which we had in-house, and this is a key. It's funny, we're talking to clients, potential clients of Kumo or on-prem. In 2024, there's a number of we'll call them API first customers that are now expressing desire to move their MTA service in-house, mainly because the hosted service cost is this level of expense that's a floor beneath their profitability. They're all wanting to bring MTAs in-house. And when I talk to them, they say, first question I ask is, you have a Composer app? And they say, no. And I go, that's the first problem you have to solve. So that's a very key point for anyone thinking about moving in-house, is you're going to have to build your Composer tier on some form or function. There are MTAs, commercial ones, that also sell middleware. I would advise not going there, because if you really want vendor lock, that would be the kiss of death. You will literally be landlocked into those commercial products. The MTA part, I mean, it's use either API or port 25 injection. It's fairly agnostic. And I always ran Power MTA as a microservice, so I could have swapped out to another vendor. But the Composer tier is going to be heavily embedded into your application logic. So just word to the wise, right? So the Composer app was managed by a gentleman named Tom Waltz, who, if you want to say who is the core foundational member of ExactTarget, it was Tom Waltz. He wrote that engine, and it's still running today. And I would dare say very few surpassed it, both reliability and volume. But he had actually built into the Composer this concept of parallel sending. The problem was he can never get anyone in infrastructure to implement it. So again, I come along as the FNG, not knowing better. I said, let's do it. So we did it. So parallel sending, you have two flavors. You can do NAT. And what does that mean? You have the NAT on the Ethernet interface, and then you have a device out, one hop out, that is going to support the public IP. So it could be a firewall, it could be a router, some type of network device. The other option you have is port address, PAT, and it is essentially the same function. You get to the same state either way. But this is how you can start to scale horizontally. And so you're not limiting the public IP to one node or one host. So going forward, we started out still on hardware. I got some bigger pieces of iron, and we built pools of 6, and we built our first parallel sending pool for Best Buy, which you may know is the consumer electronics company in the United States. And it's funny, owl laugh. I sat right outside the office of the CTO, and he pulls me in the office. He goes, Wayne, I'm looking at these numbers for Best Buy. I'm really disappointed. I need you to double check these. These cannot be accurate. And I said, no, they're accurate. He's like, you're not listening to me, Wayne. I have a meeting in an hour. I need to know these are accurate. I said, they are absolutely accurate. He's like, how did you do that? I go, well, we built the parallel pool with the new pool logic. He says, these are real numbers. He's like, yeah, they were off the charts. I mean, we're not talking about like 20% increase. We're talking like multiples, maybe 10x, right? And that really is what launched ExactTarget, where we started to be able to support these large national retailers for holiday sending. Fast forward a little bit, to control CapEx costs, the organization made the decision to go to VMware. And that way, we could essentially create capacity on demand. Now, the tricky part is now I'm being asked to build MTAs on virtualized instances, and not using any of the VMware has ability to like permanent, like allocate resources to a host as a config function. It would part of the CapEx savings was the fact that we would have demand capacity on demand based on VMware's internal logic. So one of the things I learned when I worked on SBC Yahoo was Yahoo did several town halls explaining how their infrastructure is built. And one of the things I took away from the Yahoo information was they went very wide and horizontal. What they said was, we've isolated all our services for email in such a way that if any one element breaks, the number of affected users is so small it never becomes a media event. So in a sense, that's why you rarely see any press where you'll see Yahoo had a email outage. Now this is, many years ago. I don't know what they do today, but back then they would just have these very small little clusters of, it was inbound mail plus a mail store with the storage underneath. And I took that as a very interesting approach to essentially eliminate the potential of like an all-out outage. And with ExactTarget, their high availability was a big concern. That was probably one of our strongest selling points, was the ability to not have outages, especially during peak events. So I took that idea of horizontal scaling and just applied it to the MTA tier. So it's very organic. It's not like I had this master plan with like a top-down, architectural design. I just sort of looked at operationally, what do clients want? What are the pain points? What are the undesirables? And like built from there. And it's actually fairly simple. It's simple in the sense that it's not this very large DevOps harness of hundreds of servers, right? It's not that. It's actually very small clusters built relatively simple methods. Where the complexity comes in is as we scaled it, the number of elements grew and grew and grew. But I accepted that as cost of doing business. A lot of engineers will say, well, I only want one version. I only want one config. Well, I would flip that the other way. Your clients would say, I don't want one release. I don't want one config. I don't want to deal with noisy neighbors. So by breaking it apart, we eliminated some of those pain points for clients. So it's always like engineering says, I don't want this. Well, then you've just pushed it to the client. Now you have to deal with being concerned about noisy neighbors. Well, if I'm Target, we're paying you a lot of money. Why should I ever care about noisy neighbor? I just want an SLA. So what this evolved into was at the IP level. So we went heavy with dedicated IP. We went heavy with branding, that means domain branding. And the person to thank there is sitting on the call, Mr. Al Iverson. He was early in on full branding and DMARC, and well, DKIM, SPF, then later DMARC. And we actually hosted most of our clients' DNS. The reason was back then, marketing departments had no facility to get DNS changes, and their IT departments didn't want to deal with it. So we would, I think 85% of our domains were hosted at ExactTarget, somewhere around there. And then we extended it to private pools. So we actually would give dedicated hosts to the clients. And for the enterprise clients, it was actually very desirable. And there are two categories of customers in one. One was the large marketers, because they wanted to know. I mean, and they're very methodical. When they say, we're going to send this for Black Friday, it's not accident. They've got this planned out months in advance, but the volumes are huge, right? Then the other group that wanted it, which again, sometimes accidents happen, they're happy, as we found out that regulated clients really want it. So banks, financial services. And the reason is they've got regulatory compliance reasons that they don't want anybody else's data to commingle with their physical host. I mean, physical in the sense of a virtual host, but for them, it is a literal host, right? So that's what allowed ExactTarget to really start to sell to enterprise clients. And that's always been ExactTarget Marketing Cloud's sweet spot, has been the enterprise clients. We don't do SMB as much. We're kind of expensive and hard to use. So we're not Constant Contact, we're not MailChimp. it's funny because MailChimp, whoever was over there, made a blog specifically calling out, we will never do this. And they left a blank space. They're saying the exact target, and we will never go after that clientele. So essentially they're ceding the enterprise clients to us. So it's always a choice. There's no right or wrong. It's what you desire your business to be, right? So fast forward, we got the VMs. We did a lot of tuning. It took a long time to get the VM node right. So I had to go back and forth with the teams, negotiate. The other issue is we were doing back then, we're doing the host license. So for right or wrong, they PowerMTA agreed to sell us essentially a site license. And the reason we gave them was we had to do virtualization. So we had to be able to add nodes on demand, so to speak. And to be fair, the dollar amount was a very large one at the time. So it was a fair deal for both. But what that does for us with this license is uncap the number of hosts. So essentially I could grow the number of hosts horizontally. It's no longer an issue. Which comes back to why are we talking about Kumo? So most PowerMTA users and most MTA commercial software, you either have two licensing models. You have the per envelope, right? The per message, and you have this line under your sending goes up 25%, your bill is going to go up 25%. There are some that still offer, per host licenses, but obviously you don't want to scale many small nodes. You won't get the money out of your license. With this ability to scale PowerMTA horizontally, I just went for it. Now, the interesting thing is with Kumo, because it is open source, that does open up this horizontal scaling method. And inherently, there's not a cost issue from a licensing perspective. So like I said, we added private IP, private branding, private pools. We started offering SLAs. Probably the most demanding SLA I've ever done was for Outlook, which is the flash sale division for Nordstrom. So flash sales, if you don't know, it's like when they do an auction. Flash sale is a nice name for an auction. The faster people come into the room and bid, the higher the prices go up. It's a factor of human behavior. So they wanted an SLA written contractual of 1 million messages per minute for 5 minutes, total 5 million. So we didn't guarantee delivery in the SLA. What we did was guarantee first attempt. And we then had to build a database, a data lake, a whole reporting structure to report the SLA, but we hit it consistently. I mean, this is one of those things where somebody says, well, show me the receipts. It's like that job fired every day at 11 a.m. And if there was a violation, they would notify us. We had remediation like any SLA over a time span. And I would say consistently, we hit it every day. It's just a matter of adding more nodes. We started out with 128 with 8 IPs. Later, we got bigger VMs, and VMware got better and better over the years. We actually were able to reduce that by, I think the last time I worked on it, it was from 128 down to 32. So that's quite an improvement over time. I'm not an expert on like AWS EC2 costs, but I do believe the larger units cost more. So public cloud charges you for vertical scaling. So someone would say, well, you use VMware, how does that relate to current sending in public cloud? Well, I would challenge someone to do the cost analysis. I'm betting that those medium, you don't want smalls, you probably want mediums, are much more cost effective in AC2 versus the very large ones. So vertical scaling, I mean, it makes sense. Vertical scaling hardware costs more for Amazon. And so therefore they should pass that charge on to you. So many small, mid-small to medium-sized, what you have to do is do a cost analysis to find a sweet spot. But I'm sure there's one there. And it's going to be in the medium range, not the large end. Let's see. So, when I got there, we did 1 billion in a month. The last year, they're still using my architecture. I haven't changed it significantly. The last Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Marketing Cloud at 6.8 billion. So, the method has proved itself, and I kind of have a running side bet with a couple folks that if you're aware, Salesforce is building this 360 platform that is their new consumer CDP platform that has messaging, and it's built on their hypervisor, which runs on public cloud. And they've yet to replace my architecture, from what I hear. So, I guess the proof is when you're an engineer and you leave and they still use your code, then you must have done something right. So there are challenges with parallel sending. One of them is going to be concurrency. So there's a couple ways to address that. And I'm going to put two. So one is not Kumo. So you could shape the traffic through injections. And this is what I had asked for many years was, as the Composer app's building that job and it knows this is Gmail, use the whole pool. But if it's Orange FR, use one node. Never could quite get that into code. Now SparkPost has a host of service. They actually have a very elegant solution. It's called limited connection tier. And simply that if this recipient domain is in a list, requeue that message to another set of hosts limited to 3 nodes. So you have a maximum concurrency of 3. So that limited connection tier is a valid method. Now the Kumo side of the house, and I was talking to Mike because I'm thinking, here's all these ways around the problem. He's like, well, you have cluster awareness with Kumo. So that actually solves a major problem of parallelism, is cluster aware sending configs. So that would, Mike and Tom are very much like, Kumo's not just a open source replacement for PowerMTA, is actually better than PowerMTA. So PowerMTA never had cluster awareness. And I will, so Tom and I are good friends. We know each other. Tom, they turned off cluster awareness and hosted because of performance issues. So Tom, for years, it's like, you should switch to Momentum because that's cluster awareness. I get to SparkPost and it's like, well, we turned it off. I'm like, oh, Tom owes me a beer. And we had the same problem. That's why they built the limited connection tier. That's actually a better approach if you don't have good clustering. But with Kumo, you've got a new generation of this clustering that should be performant. And that will be all of us as a community testing. It's like we're going to have to stress test that clustering function to see, is it performant? Thing about all this, like when you send $1 billion a month, you're going to have, you can't get caught up in perfection. There's just no way. People ask me like, what is my job? That people who are in IT, I go, imagine there's someone like at Indianapolis Airport is one of the hubs for FedEx. I guarantee you there are several very experienced operation managers at FedEx, and every day they're dealing with, traffic jams, storms, airplane breaks, pilots don't show up. Stuff just happens, but day in and day out, FedEx gets it done, right? So you can't get too, like if the setting is supposed to be 100 per hour and it does 102, like don't stress, I've actually had, it's funny, just war stories. I have people who are on the client side say, can you change the rate of X from 100 to 120? And I'm thinking that's not material, but I smile and say yes, and I do the ticket. But as you who run the MTAs, don't let yourself get stressed over these things. I would say close enough is good for horseshoes, hand grenades, and MTAs, right? But what you can't have is like huge discrepancies, right? Because that will hit a bell somewhere and somebody will block you. So the other part about parallel is you like SparkPost hosted does do, I would call more of the one large pool method. And these are no right or wrong answers, these are choices, right? So the advantage of doing one big giant pool is you're aggregating more clients over one compute resource. And so law of averages, you average out more of the hotspots. So if somebody's really heavy one day, if you're spreading across 100 nodes, you're less likely to even see the needle move, right? So when you do these smaller pools, you're going to have capacity planning in real time, somewhat real time as a method. So what we did was, since we're doing virtualization, we would have for our standard like default pool we would build is 6 active nodes and 2 standbys. Trivia, the Y6, that was the limit for Big Pond. And if you know limits, you laugh because you go, oh, yeah. There's actually me and Phil Schott, Al, that came to the gentleman's agreement on that. But we had 2 hot spares, and since they're virtual, they're really not costing much dollar-wise compute. So what would happen is inevitably you get a high Q event, it's a multi-tenant, and so stuck in here, I've got one sender who did a bad thing, and then in there I've got a couple people who are doing transactional emails, and they're under a lot of pain because those nodes are really hosed up. What we would do is pop the 2 hot nodes or hot spares in, empty queue, immediately sending. We've already paused the job for the bad sender. And the Composer app was like a load balancer, detected, oh, these are responding, and starts injecting it. So with 2 clicks of a mouse, we could essentially remediate a production issue. And that became a very, very good way for us to manage. But because you're not spreading across a large number of nodes, you can't count on the law of averages to bail you out. Now, the interesting thing is we would have still, even on private pools, clients that misbehave, but they're all in the same company. And so the first time that happened was a large software company in Washington. And one division did a very bad thing with their user agreement email. So we call them AEP emails. So like they have to send to all, which inherently means they're going to be not well received, a lot of bouncing. And so a gaming division sent out their AUP, and then we'll call it office division was very upset. And normally they would be really angry at us. But we explained, well, you have a private pool, and so it's your other division that caused the issue. The gentleman who's the manager of the office division said, thank you very much, we're going to hold an internal meeting. And so then like 2 hours later, they said, delete all their queues. But they were thanking us, like, your architecture is brilliant. And because the thing was, it was an internally managed event. If it had been company X, right, they would have been very angry at us. So you could see where private service changes that dynamic for enterprise. Let's see, I've got a few notes. So build time is an issue. So, when you're aggregating all of that capacity over 100 nodes, you have a very gentle slope for capacity adds. So you can build and not be super quick about it. We're building on demand. Like I'm not getting an order, like we sign a deal, right? And they want a private pool, I got to provide like MTAs and IPs right away. So you have to have a very efficient build process. The other thing is the number of servers or configurations you manage goes up. So, this is usually where engineering staff don't like this method because it's saying you're creating snowflakes everywhere. Well, so because we did all this customization and using PowerMTA as technology, we had the VMTA stanza. So we had, when I left, we had 70,000 VMTA stanzas under, yeah, Tom's laughing. He was in that meeting, stanzas under management. And so, we were building just our own pipelines. Yeah, 70,000. And some of those had includes. So it might even been like 80. We built our own pipeline. It wasn't great, but it got the job done. Again, I'm going to come back to why is Kumo better than PowerMTA? Well, this whole thing where you have this concept of config as code, right? Once I'm not an expert at using that method in Kumo. I haven't used the database function yet. I'm still using the flat file functions. But as soon as Mike explained that to me, I was like, oh, this would have been awesome at Marketing Cloud because it actually builds a sustainable method for a high number of configurations,
I'm just going to interject for a second there. When
sure.
when Tom and I were selling Momentum back in the day, Momentum, generally speaking, like it worked like PowerMTA in the sense that it would preload the entire config. And if it had includes, it would preload the include files. And we had a customer that was doing about 4,000 bindings, VMTAs per server, and started running into a wall because they were exceeding memory consumption because it just didn't allocate that much RAM to holding the config,
Yeah.
and we had to custom configure the MTA nodes in order to have them use more memory. And
Well,
so that levels memories, and that's why KumoMTA lazy loads. It doesn't load a config item until it needs to use it.
Yeah. See, I hacked a workaround to that by just saying I will never go to that number by making smaller pools, right? So like the largest pool we ever made IP wise, and it was an accident because we, you know how things happen. We got to where we had parallel pools. We had this really great throughput, right? So we just kept adding customers. And then I remember the admin, we looked at each other like, we're up to 1,400 sending IPs in pool one. And we were both looking at each other like we really screwed up. So we actually had a multi-year project to divide that pool out. Like we split it in half to 700 something. Then we split it in half again to 300 something. I think we left it there as good enough. But yeah, that's where like we avoided that. And I remember talking to Scott, you know, and probably Tom about those limits. And that was one of the limits. So I avoided that limit by just essentially making smaller pools. We tried different flavors of like our default pool, and what we ended up with was the 6 nodes, 2 standbys, and 64 sending IPs. And that seemed to work really well with the flavor of VM that we used. So it was a different solution to the same problem. I would say like, you know, our one pool with 1,400, we were kind of like horrified we'd done that to ourselves, because if one node goes down, even though we have parallel, that's a lot of customers impacted. And this comes back to the whole thing with Yahoo, that you never wanted any surface area to be larger than X. So your largest potential outage was only this postage size stamp. Yeah. Yeah, so that's another, there are some pain points with parallelism. Tom and I joked, I broke NAT. I broke the private IP space, in the sense I used up so much private IP space at Salesforce, because it was all routable. We essentially ran out of contiguous blocks. The solution we ended up doing there was private networks. So at that point, it actually simplified my build process. I do the 10.000. Every data center had 10.0.0, and it was non-routable. It was routable out to the internet, but not routable back into Salesforce. Now, Salesforce didn't like it, but I kind of told him to just deal with it. See, there's always like somebody in IT going, oh, that's like a horrible thing you've done. I go, thank you, I have. But the thing is, we only need, so that's the other thing, like, and we're talking about very large scaling, right? So there are dependencies in the data center. So we would run into issues with the Cisco or Juniper core router capacity. Now, to be clear, they make huge enterprise telco routers that can support huge numbers of things, but they get very expensive. So it's not a limit of it's not available, right? But it's a limit on cost. We always had private paths of egress. So for both DNS and SMTP, we would go out a different channel. We would never go out the same link tier as the application tier or the API inbound interface, because we would essentially DDoS those. So, and again, this is when you get into the number of billions, right? But these are all achievable engineering goals. Folks have to kind of let go of things to say like, okay, there's going to be these VLANs that are just for MTA. For security, injection point from the composer into the MTA is very limited. So really only the composer app can talk into that tier. And that actually provides a lot of isolation from a security perspective. And then everything just goes out, and then we can scale the hardware and services just for egress. And I'll bring DNS up because DNS is very chatty, and a lot of devices, it's not a like gigabyte per second problem, it's a session problem. So I've blown up a ton of network gear because the sheer amount of DNS sessions for UDP can be astronomically high. And that's even with 3 layers of caching. It still was like this giant number. So you should always be concerned about how DNS will behave within your MTA infrastructure, because DNS will be the Achilles heel. It's going to be the thing that breaks first. So, yes, question.
So I've actually been trying to contemplate DNS for the past year and a half as we look to make some changes here on our side. In that context, especially when it comes to caching and management of DNS. So typically we know that most MTA solutions do manage their own cache of DNS internally, but likewise they reach out, and whether that whether if you're using Windows or Linux, because I know there are Power MTA installations out there that do use Windows. But with that said, regardless, let's assume Linux for a moment, and you have it as a /resolve, and maybe you're hitting your own local DNS cache, or if you're hitting one upstream. In that context, have you found benefits with respect to, or either where would you say the cost benefit line lies with respect to running DNS caching locally on the individual MTA versus running them as kind of a I guess your own DNS solution at that point that maybe talks to stream DNS or somewhere else in that regard?
So I'm going to give you a very basic recipe that I used at Bell, Southwest Bell, because they were having multiple DNS outages or email outages due to lack of DNS infrastructure. I think 4 different times the DNS team at a SBC brought me a cluster, and I broke all of them. So what we ended up doing, we had to use what was approved software. So we were running AIX, believe it or not, and it shipped with bind. So we had to use bind, and we would put bind on every local host. Then we would point those bind resolvers to the internet, just standalone, each man on their own. So when I went to ExactTarget, I refined it a bit more. So PowerMTA, actually, you can define the resolver and not use resolve.com. And the reason we did that was ExactTarget was primarily a Windows shop, and I kept blowing up AD, causing production outages for everyone. Even after I told them every single time, I actually sent an email saying, if I do this, I will take it down, so you are aware when it happens. And then it happened over and over again for like 2 years because of one individual, being very headstrong. That being said, we use PowerMTA. Finally got to the right position. I enhanced what I did Bell. We used PowerMTA pointed to its own resolver, which is localhost. So we ran bind on each host. Those bind servers then pointed to a cluster of bind servers using the bind configs, not a load balancer. And then those bind would go out the egress point, not through the middle tier and not through the front. And that's how we got the thing to scale. One time we tried to use a load balancer, we blew that up. We used F5 technology, which is pretty high end, right? And again, it comes back to cost. They said, well, in order to handle this many sessions, this would be this, big IP. It would be this. We'd have to buy a dedicated F5 big IP that was the biggest they had. And even then it was sort of questionable. So it's sort of like, using the bind config to figure out which host in your cluster. I mean, that's 0 cost, and it works. Now, those resolvers only did resolving work. So we did have split brain DNS, and we eventually got to where I convinced the AD team to let us do the transfer for the internal host names. So our bind resolvers actually had the whole universe at that point. And then it worked very well. So, but yeah, DNS is actually a primary concern when you're scaling up. You have to address it. I remember being on a call when the Bell and all those things kept going down. Some VP said, is there a way to make email work without DNS? Yeah, I think that was, I had to bite my tongue and say, no, sir, there is not.
You can use an IP literal in the recipient address if you want.
Well, correct. So this was all T1 clients for Ameritech, and I said, well, sir, if someone from networks could provide me all the stuff, then perhaps, yes, I could cobble together a giant Etsy host file like they did in 1978. So, but yeah, it's that's the thing. Like we kept taking down AD, which has Active Directory as a DNS function, but those are built for corporate functions. They're not built for like millions and billions of resolutions for caching. It's not the right tool for that use case. So nothing wrong with the technology. You got a question now?
Yeah, so Wayne, it was interesting to hear about the challenges around scalability. We were certainly there together, dealing with some of them together. That concurrency limiting being the big one there, where the people above us just didn't realize that we were big enough and setting enough mail
Yeah,
that we could pound other ISPs flat. It was just crazy.
yeah,
And I remember the challenges they're trying to convince them that no, we actually have to back off here. You can't just go full throttle all the time and let the internet figure it out.
yeah,
Um, the other challenge there that really got away from our employer at the time was policy compliance in that realm, right? Like everything stood up to be so big, so fast, and grow, grow, grow. Nobody stopped to think what happens when queues get choked. And now you talked a bit about separating instances and separating pools to keep hotspots from causing broad effect. But I feel like that's something they never really mastered well. Like, think if I was going to
well,
build that today,
yeah.
we're almost missing that part of like, how do you monitor what clients are doing to be able to actually put the kibosh on bad mail that's large and going nowhere?
Yeah, some of that goes to product, right? And you and I have chatted. We have our opinions of it. One thing I brought to management is that our contracts would say you could send X billion per year, right? And what I said was missing, and this is specifically talking to the VP of infrastructure, right? So you manage CapEx, the whole stack. I said the contracts actually don't reflect any rate over time aspect. Like you could say I could send $1 billion a year, but it's actually bound time-wise to be like X amount per day or X amount per week even. So now, to be fair, what was kind of the secret sauce, it's like the old joke, the first one's free, right? We would allow anyone to do whatever they want, and essentially they would burn through their subscription, and then they would have to renew sooner than a year. So there are political forces and financial forces to not cap it. But yeah, essentially it's uncapped, and that's what you're speaking of. Now, as far as the MTA tier goes, and I was very much the one who did the updates for both Exact Target, Marketing Cloud, and SparkPost. Primary job was doing the MTA setting configs. So these days I'm more of a data analyst. I'm not on call anymore. I'm not doing production work. But my rule has always been, I've been on the ISP side, right? I was a SBC Yahoo. We had the gateways there. I always used the old MC Hammer song, like hammer them, don't hurt them, right? Like I know what hurts them. So I would always counsel the config to be gentle to the receiver. And if they have published postmaster pages, I'll honor them. If through back channel, somebody named Alex says, please don't do that, I will not do that. I don't know if Alex is here, but my job is to not cause them a production issue, because if you want to get blocked, if what you're doing raises to the point where you're on their radar, then that's never going to help your client, so yeah, that's where at the end I was actually pushing for the limited connection tier, because they weren't going to solve it at the composer level. And what Al and I talked about many times was we're really good at sending really large jobs for really large clients to really large ISPs. The folks that were really suffering was like in the B2B space. So it's like corporate clients sending, highly desired, like vendor emails, like there's a vendor relationship, like ordering something going on, right? They're sending confirmations of transactions back to their vendor, and we were just killing their corporate gateway. And we were just not very nice about it. And so that's kind of the advantage of horizontal scaling is you get massive throughput, but the disadvantage is the small fish, I call them, tend to get caught, and not in a good way. But there are solutions. And again, this is where Kumo comes in. Like I would tell you, like, if I could take blank page, write a config from scratch, I would do this. Most configs have this idea of star, which means anything not matching, do this. And it would be one connection, right? Now, what you'd have to do is invest in, here are all the big fish. They all have to have explicit entries. But in reality, they probably should. Should you not have an explicit entry for Earthlink? It's a big enough fish. You should care. Now you have to spend the time to build that file, but that's part of your job, is to care about those things if you're managing the configs. But that way, everybody who's not listed explicitly gets the small fish setting. And, you know, somebody say, what if somebody builds a new mailbox provider that's really big? It's like, you're going to know about it months in advance, right? I'm sorry. I mean, if Oracle announces tomorrow, we're building a new consumer-based mail platform for Oracle, that's going to be in the news. You're going to have time to put that setting in. It's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to get fired. Trust me. Yeah.
That, and really, if you're monitoring, you're going to see queue backlog.
You should see. Yeah.
If you see a big pile of backlogging, you know you have a domain at that point that needs to have some extra settings.
Yeah. And that's the thing. There should be a repeatable virtuous cycle, whatever they call it. The big part of that is I'm pulling all this data from the data lake. I'm looking for issues and then refactoring, you know. So for example, you have migrations. Those are big events. So like when Hotmail Classic moved to Hotmail EOP, that was a big event. My understanding is Big Pond is going away finally. After many years, it's finally going to go away. So there will be a transformation for Big Pond. Should be on your radar, you know. Things that we're monitoring specifically for was like the whole Yahoo Gmail auth rollout. Was a hot button topic. I had reports every day. I'm looking at those reports. Like when is the hockey stick going to occur? April 30th? April, you know, June 30th? You know, that was always the, you know, big question. So, but you should be aware of those things, right? Let's see. So a few things that I would say, you know, if you're asking like the future of MTAs and where I see this going. So one of the things that's really lacking, I believe, and maybe this is where Kumo gets another advantage, yet another advantage, right? There's not a lot of tools within the MTA layer for domain awareness in the sense of domain warming. Domain warming is a real thing. I have measured it like a traffic light for Gmail. I had a client who had their ISP that sent off of Spark Post. They had their own shared pool infrastructure, you know, and they did like good, medium, bad, right? And what they assumed was that the IP rep for Gmail would allow them to introduce new sending domains and ride on the existing reputation based on those IPs. That is not the case. You will get about a 48-hour block period. And they're doing some sampling. Gmail's gateway is going to take in a few messages, look at them, do their measurement, and then they'll say, you're good, or nope, you're not good. And they were very upset that their thesis was not correct. So I was somewhat the bearer of bad news. So the only function was, then we told them, you will have to find a way within your composer list and your app, list management / composer function to then, in a sense, create the concept of domain warming, which they do not have. So, and then again, they were asking us to slow things down. Well, if you're slowing things down, how do you do that in a shared pool service where it's different clients, right? Existing client could go full speed, 65 miles an hour. New client, you go 35 miles an hour. You're in the school zone. Another function that Kumo has, which I was blown away by, was you have this function of being able to do policies based on tenant campaign ID. If clients took advantage of that, that actually could give you a path out. So you could say, this is a new client, they get this policy. I haven't played enough with Kumo to factor to create that, but at least the data points exist, right? One of the things at ExactTarget that they asked for Power MTA for years was campaign awareness. And it went back and forth, and at the end of the day, it was a stalemate. Wasn't going to happen. So, you know, even within the existing campaigns of the same sending domain, you might say, well, this one we want to go slower for any number of reasons. So to have that done at the MTA layer takes that burden off the composer, because everything you add to the composer adds complexity, and adding complexity always reduces throughput. It's simple compute because you got a database function somewhere, right? So they would like to offload that to the MTA layer, but the MTA layer then has to say, based on this metadata, whether it's an X header or something, do a different policy. So The other thing I think that needs to be looked at better is in public cloud, we do have a proxy method to support public IPs. What I would tell you is that everyone who's done the proxy in AWS, because the proxies have to stay up all the time. If you have one email, right, it's your firewall or your network device, it has to be lit all the time. And as we know, anything in the cloud that's on 24/7, 52 gets very expensive. So for larger shops, they can look at private link. That's where you get a direct network connection into your own data center, and then you're managing that egress device. But for smaller shops, that's a bit painful. So that cost function of public cloud for outbound, don't know. The other thing I would say for future is containerization. So at Salesforce, we did do a POC of containerizing PowerMTA. I know that there's a ESP that's using on-prem that's also doing containers. I would say Spark Post Hosted doesn't. And I would say after using just, I call plain old nodes on AWS, and it could be GCP or Azure, I don't know if containerization for MTAs really buys you that much, because the level of complexity goes way up. Because what you're trying to do is there's two factors. You're doing stateful service outbound. It's a very bad mix with containers. There are ways around it. So for example, if you're creating and destroying containers, well, you can't create and destroy the storage that might have a queue with active mail items. So we were actually looking at, believe it or not, NFS and having the spools on NFS, which then adds a whole nother layer of things that I don't really like, right? Or you do what we call the sweep method. Now, this is something I know I've talked to you, Tom and Mike, about. So even without containers, doing a sweep helps. This is the idea that most CSPs, if you look at their sending, it's like 6 a.m., then noon, 1 p.m., then there's real quiet stuff. And you get down to where, especially like for maintenance, we would actually disable MTA so that, those two hot spares, we'd actually use as a rotate, like for patching and things. But we'd always have this residual of 112 mail items that we know are never going to get delivered. But we can't just delete them, right? So the idea to push those mail items from one host to another, that would be a really, I would say to Kumo, build that in as a default sample config. How to sweep your queues from one host to another in a safe fashion, because that gives the folks a lot of ability to offline an element very quickly and do maintenance, like you're doing OS patching, doing new version, right? So it's a real blocking and tackling thing for operations teams. One other advantage of these small pools, so I'm not picking on Spark Post, but they do this one large pool thing. What that means is you really can only have one version. I always have multiple versions. So, more sophisticated product release cycles. I had a director that said, I worked for a company that did 11 different versions in 12 languages. So he was used to having this very highly sophisticated release pipeline, right? I didn't want that much, but I wanted at least 1 or 2 or 3 versions, right? Because I hate pushing the all change. That's when you get your black swans. It's you do a very well-intentioned, well-vetted change that has unknown unknowns that ends up breaking everything. As an MTA manager, you never want to be in that position. So what I would do is if I need to do something different or advanced, I would actually do it in those pools where that client had escalated. And I've got this escalation to say I have to do it. We would burn it in week, month. If it's something that turns out to be benefit to all senders, then we nominate it. And then we can still do a rolling migration. And because I have so many pools, I don't actually know how many pools I have in my head, but it probably was somewhere between 100, 150 pools. So that gives me a lot of opportunities to say, I'm going to start this 4-week migration to this new default config. And at any point in there, if I see some unwanted behaviors, I can immediately stop or roll back. If you do one giant pool, you kind of are bound to what's the runtime for the one giant pool? Oh, it's 16 hours. So if you do a bad one, 16 hours to roll back, that gets really painful. So, any other questions? I think I've talked quite a bit, so.
So we're coming up on time, but happy to go a few minutes over if anybody has anything else they'd like to ask. I will also point out to Wayne that I should have told you we already did build a sample init.lua that will sweep.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah,
done.
so there's a couple questions. So would you use PowerMTA or Kumo? You know, I've used PowerMTA for 15 years, right? So obviously the familiarity is there. You know, I think the better question is, what is your business model and where do you want to invest your money and how, right? So if your plans are to get very large, right? Kumo long-term is the solution because it's going to untie you from those contracts that I think today are almost universally per message. And so think about this. You have a company that's acquiring senders. Company vendor X that sells the MTA software, they're putting like a flat percentage cost under your sending. You're the one that has to go out and get all these customers. You have to acquire them, get them signed, onboard them, all that. The MTA vendor's just sitting there collecting the money. So the question is, do you want to get out of that paradigm? Now, that being, you know, those of us that done open source, you know, it's not free. And if you need support, so like if you're, I'm just saying, if you're Netflix and you're using Redis, you probably have some form of support. You're just not using Redis based on Reddit posts, right? Because it's the core technology you've determined to use for your platform. So it's a different type of investment. So, you know, for example, I know their companies are heavily involved in Go. And so what do? They fund the org. They go to the conventions. They're sponsors at the conventions. And they also have like the hearts and minds of that development community. So it's a different type of investment. So I'm not going to give you black or white. I would choose one or the other. Now, that being said, I'm very intrigued by Kumo. I've always thought, like, could we build an open source outbound MTA? Never really existed that much. There's folks have tried, definitely, but Kumo to me seems like this might actually catch and have wide adoption. And then again, these advanced feature sets that Kumo has, we're not seeing in these other vendors. So it definitely raises the game for everyone. You know, so this commercial vendor X put in domain awareness and domain warming. They're going to have to with the new paradigm that, you know, Yahoo and Gmail are enforcing. It cracks me up where people are saying like, well, I switch my domains every day. I'm just thinking like, you're just going to hit a brick wall because every new domain you send from has got no reputation. If you understand that concept in machine learning, it's not negative reputation, it's zero reputation. But if you're just swapping out like your domains every day, it's like you're always going to be at no reputation and you're going to get that. So
especially since no reputation is sometimes worse than negative reputation in some of the filters because they don't trust implicitly somebody new, they distrust them implicitly.
Yeah, it's kind of like sending from a new cold IP every day. So any other questions? I'll just put a plug in. I am between jobs. So anyone who needs, I basically said, like, if you need to send 1 billion or more emails per day, then give me a call. The thing I like about this pool methodology is that it actually can work for small shops. It's not, you know, when you're saying I'm going to build a DevOps pipeline for 100+ nodes, that takes quite a bit of expertise and investment. To say I'm going to build a logical pool that has 6 active nodes and 2 standbys, that's something achievable for small shops even, you know. And so I'm doing a little consulting. I'm trying to talk folks into like, hey, it would be worth getting at least 1 extra node in production and just not have it be off to the side. And if bad things happen, we go in the load balancer, right? We just click the button. So it's something that can be done for smaller shops. Cool.
Yeah, well, Wayne, you beat me to the plug at the end there. I was definitely going to say if anybody wants to be able to scale it to a ridiculous level, they have an opportunity right now if they can beat the rest to it. All right. Thanks everyone for coming out. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you in the Discord.